This morning, we welcome Carolyn Preece, who claims her photography is a reflection of both her life in London and her rural upbringing in a small country village in south of England. She is drawn to human elements and documenting everyday life that could be chance occurrences, captured moments, a look, a gaze, a feeling, an attitude, a time or place. She also seeks an escape from the hustle and bustle and creates minimalist snowscapes and seascapes, which provide her with space to breathe away from the urban density of city life. Her work is divided into 4 categories: black and white street, color street, cafe culture, and scapes, on which we will delight in viewing along with Carolyn's wise words of wisdom of how we can capture those special moments. Welcome, Carolyn, and the stage is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, let me just share my screen. It's always the most nerve-wracking element of it. Okay, bear with me 1 second. It's funny, no matter how many times you do this, it's all, and even practicing just before going in, it's always worrying.
Okay, we have great. Your screen now, Carolyn.
Excellent. Great. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate you taking time out on such a gorgeous day to come and see me and listen to me. This is my talk, Tools Not Rules. The presentation itself has come about as a result of a journey I've been on and am still on. It very much started as a result of listening to judges about talking about putting things on the third. Now, I'm not very good at accepting things. I need to understand the why, the reason behind things. What impact does it actually have? You could just say I'm really bad at following instructions. However, understanding the why empowers you. It gives you choice. If I know why, I can make informed decisions. What I found, however, was that no one ever talked about the impact on the image of following or breaking the so-called rules. They just said do X or Y with no explanation. That for me was an issue. How can I make decisions based on no real information? And this is what this talk is about. It's about empowerment and sharing what I've learned so far in my photographic journey. I believe fundamentally we're taught composition in the wrong way. Not enough focus is placed on photography as a visual language or on the psychology behind how we interpret the visual elements in an image. Instead, what we get are endless conversations about rules and breaking them. And this doesn't help us create meaningful, impactful images. What we should be taught is the effect of our choices on how the viewer experiences our image. This would then help us communicate more effectively through them. I hope in this talk to take you on a journey which makes you look at photography and composition in a different light. I want to empower you to make conscious choices about how your images look and feel. And these choices will enable you to express what you want to say, make the viewer look at what you want them to look at, and make them feel like you want them to feel. They don't all need to be done in camera. They can also happen at the editing stage and post-processing stage. And to be honest, if you've not come across this before, there's a lot to take in. You're not going to remember it all. But I think for me, the important thing is sharing another way of looking at things and hopefully creating a curiosity to explore and learn more. The talk itself is based on visual design, visual language, and psychology. The tools I'm looking at are nothing new. They're used in the design of websites, user interfaces, marketing material, etc. They're just, for some reason, not talked about so much in the photography context. And as a photographer, it can actually be quite hard to find information beyond the so-called compositional rules. It's once again, do this, do that, rule of thirds. No explanation of how it makes an image better or worse. And therefore, I will include a list of sources and I'll share this again at the end of the talk. At the end of the talk, if you are interested, you may want to take a photo of this with your phone. But these are basically the things which actually helped me start out on this journey. The first ones to mention are Eileen Rafferty, the B&H videos. B&H is a big American photography store. And I mean, I initially started looking at trying to find out what impact did putting something on the third have. As I said, it wasn't enough to say for me to hear, oh, it has a positive impact on the photo. I wanted to know why. And it was really hard trying to find that information. And I think my first step along the way was Eileen Rafferty. And I mean, her videos are brilliant, recommend anybody and everybody to watch them. But she started introducing me to the language. And then once you start finding the right search terms, it makes everything get a lot easier. It helps you actually find the right information. The next person I want to mention is David Duchemin. Now, I quote him quite a lot through this talk. He's brilliant. He has published numerous books. He's got a website. He does courses. He has an interesting blog. He's got I'm not sure if his podcast is still running, but he had a podcast. And he's really interesting in terms of photography as a visual language and talking about communicating through your images. I should probably say at this point, I've never met the man. I'm not on commission from him. He doesn't know I exist. Probably should be on commission for him. I know a few people have bought stuff based on that, but no, he's just brilliant. And then the final book is See It, Photographic Composition Using Visual Intensity. This is the book which helped me start to put everything I was learning together. It helped me start making sense of what I was reading and finding out and watching. It's a really interesting take when you look at visual intensity. We will be talking about that later on. So this is what I'll be covering. There's 3 sections. After section 2, there'll be a break. In section 1, we're looking at photography as a visual language. In section 2, it's more about how we make sense of the visual world. In section 3, we then go into a little bit more detail about the elements within an image. Within section 1, there's going to be an element of audience participation. I'll let you know when we're there. What I'd like to do, if this was a smaller group, I would ask you to actually call out. With 100 odd people, that will be carnage. So I'll ask you to write things in chat. Okay, so first question. Are there actually rules to break? You can probably get an idea of where I'm coming from this from what I've said already. It's fundamentally what the talk is about. I don't believe there are rules, only tools, hence the title. There are only choices and visual consequences. But rules and guidelines are talked about a lot. Does it benefit anyone? As you start off, it sometimes helps to have some basic guidelines to follow whilst we figure everything out. It's the equivalent of teaching a beginner to ride a horse. You kick to go, pull left rein to go left, right rein to go right, both reins to stop. As you become more proficient, however, you learn to refine this. You weight your left seat bone to turn left. You ride straight on a circle. You control the shoulders. If you started off telling a total beginner to weight their left seat bone to turn left, they'd be dealing with so much other stuff they'd struggle. They'd look at you as if you've gone mental. They may never get back on the horse again, as everything is just far too complicated. In any hobby or sport, you simplify things for people to help them at the start of their journey. The next stage, however, is to go beyond it. Going beyond it is what started me on my photographic journey, exploring the psychology behind composition. So in summary, rules do make life easy, but moving beyond them will help get your photography to the next level. It'll help you be more creative, make more informed choices, make images feel like you want them to feel. It'll allow you to take a scene which you find interesting, inspiring, beautiful, sad, or in some other way meaningful, and present it to the viewer in a manner which conveys the meaning in the strongest possible way. So, if your photo is about dereliction, make it feel that way. If you're photographing a beautiful beach scene, how do you make it reflect what you experienced on the day? It's all about informed choice. This image here is the winner of the World Press Photo a few years ago. It was shot in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, in 2019. Yasuyoshi Chiba's image depicts a passionate poetry reading during a sit-in as part of protests calling for an end to the 30-year rule of the dictator Omar al-Bashir. Do you think this image communicates a moment and the experience of being there clearly? Do you get a sense of what it was like, the emotion behind the scene, what's happening, what's going on, what people are feeling? Can you imagine what it would be like to experience this, it being here? So the next section, what is photography? Bit of an odd question for photographers, but bear with me. And this is a great quote from Ming Fine. Photography is fundamentally a relationship between the photographer and the viewer. Nothing more, nothing less. At its core, a successful image is about communication. It must tell the viewer the photographer's intended story through an entirely and solely visual means of communication. So basically, it's a visual language. But what makes a strong photograph? A strong photograph is one where the photographer has something to say, where they have a voice, where their unique take on the world shines through in their images. Creating images with impact is all about finding your voice. What do you have to say about the world you live in and the subjects you photograph? Even if you don't actually have physical words to express what you want to say or what you feel, your images can actually speak for you. This is an image I took of rush hour in London pre-COVID, and I very much wanted to convey what rush hour felt like. So what do you think I felt about it? Looking at this photo, is this something enjoyable? Is it a positive experience? Would you want to be there? Yeah, I don't think anyone wants to be in rush hour, to be fair, but it's trying to convey an emotion and a feeling of what it's like to be amidst that mass of crowds. So now we come on to the bit where I'll ask for some answers from you. It's a little experiment. I don't want you to overthink this, but I would like you to write in chat, what is the first thing which comes to your mind when I say the word chocolate? As I say, don't overthink it, just write in chat, what's the first thing which comes to your mind? Okay, I think we've got quite a lot of answers already there. I've actually got access to this. I don't think you used to have access to chat, so I'll start reading a few out. Easter, sweet, where's mine, yummy, smooth, indulgence, Cadbury's, taste, diet. Diet chocolate would be an interesting one, or probably you can't have it because of a diet. Bitter, rich, dairy milk, pleasure. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, everybody. That's great. But I think what's an interesting exercise here is the amount of variety within your answers. Even for something as simple as chocolate, we all think about it differently. Now imagine how this translates to more complex matters in the world. We all think about and experience the world differently from each other. And it's really important to recognize this when we talk about photography as a language and an importance in communicating your viewpoint. Because fundamentally, you're unique. You see and think about things differently from everybody else. and your images should therefore reflect this perspective. Or, as Elliot Erwitt put it, I found it has little to do with the things you see and everything to do with the way you see them. So, coming back to what makes a strong photograph, it is where you felt a connection to the subject matter, where you've something to say about a time, a place, a situation, or an emotion. So, for example, landscape photography. You need to know, what is it in particular about the scene you want to show the viewer? What do you want to bring to their attention? Landscape photography is basically the art of saying, hey, stop it, look at this. Wow, isn't this amazing? Or interesting or fascinating? Conversely, if you're not interested in what you're photographing, how do you think your viewer will think about it? Why should they be interested? If you have no interest in people, you're never going to make a good street photographer. If you're not interested in and passionate about animals, this will be reflected in your wildlife photography. It will lack soul. You need to be engaged with what you photograph. It needs to interest you. It needs to inspire you. So, for example, putting this into a personal context, I've always had an interest in people. Years ago, I temped in the Institute of Civil Engineers, and the staircases there were lined with these grand, old-fashioned, lifelike portraits of former presidents, successful engineers in their time. And I used to love looking at these portraits. I studied them, imagined who they were, what they did, their stories. I was fascinated by the pictures and the people in them. You could almost say it was a form of time travel. People taken out of their time and transported into the 21st century. I also love listening in on conversations on trains, shopping centres and cafes. Where other people get annoyed at loud phone conversations, I actually think they're great. They're basically like short stories in a book, but without context. Leaves you wondering what happened before, what will happen next. And I have to confess, sometimes I actually want to stay on the bus or the train, hang around, find out what the next stage is in the story. But unsurprisingly, therefore, a lot of my photography is street photography. But I also think in stories. Now, I very much blame my mother for this. And I should say at this point, she knows I blame her. She knows I've blamed her to people all around England, so she's fine with it. But basically, I'm an only child, and with this comes an overactive imagination. When I grew up and was at home, I had no one to play with, and therefore I had to entertain myself. So I used to create my own worlds, stories, adventures, and this now shows through in my photography. Through the conscious use of cropping to include and exclude certain things from the frame, I can express these stories, create connections, imply relationships where none existed. I basically create my own fictions. Not all my photography is like this, but there's a definite element there. And it comes back to the chocolate conversation. It's my perspective on the world. So an example here is this image I took in Canary Wharf. Deliberately cropped out a lot of the detail. You can't see who the people are, so encouraging you to imagine. But there's only three main things within that image: the people and the bikes. There's that guy walking off. In my mind, it's like they've had some sort of meeting, something's happened. And also the fact that that guy's standing there facing what looks like a wall. It just asks a lot of questions of the viewer. So it's thinking about so in my mind, there's a whole sort of scene going on, where there's some sort of meeting, something's happened. But I do this through the use of the cropping and excluding extraneous detail. It's also worth being mindful, however, that the image a camera takes is very clinical. It doesn't record the sounds, smells, temperature in the air, the atmosphere. It doesn't record what happened before or after you pressed the shutter button, or the environment the subject's in, beyond what you see in the frame. And this is where post-processing comes in. You can make your images reflect how you experience the world, not just what it looked like. You can direct the viewer to think what you want them to think about the subject. With your choice of post-processing, you can further express an idea or concept which may not be apparent in the original, very clinical image taken straight from the camera. And I think the next one, just for interest, so I think it's always useful, A, to see where an image started, and B, how you can change the whole feel of an image through post-processing. This is where it started. As you can see, very different from the original. The original, to me, say I've called it The Last Days of Summer. It was taken in Brightling Sea. Everybody takes brightly coloured beach huts in Brightling Sea. Me being me, I had my camera, it's got 2 cards, sort of raw JPEG. I've set it to black and white. I'm doing something totally different. I've called it The Last Days of Summer, but to me, it doesn't just feel, because I took it in September, it's not just the last days of summer, it also has a certain melancholy feel. I feel like the last days of childhood and the growing up and passage of time. But that's, as I say, that's the only child thing. So next, I've got this quote from David Duchamine. Photography is an extraordinary means of communication, but first we need to have something to say. If someone came and stood next to you, would they take exactly the same photo as you? If you don't find the slightest reflection of yourself in your images, they become generic. They could be taken by absolutely anybody. It's a photograph of something, not about something. Photographs won't speak to your viewer if you yourself don't have something to say. So what wows you, shocks you, moves you, or horrifies you? How do you see the world? How do you think about things? It's also worth bearing in mind that photography can be either a reflection of or a reaction to your environment, or even your state of mind. So for instance, I've grown up in a really beautiful area of the world, West Sussex. I grew up opposite the South Downs. And as a result, I'm fascinated by starker, harsher landscapes. And this is a reaction to the environment of my childhood. Nothing unusual there. We often find interesting the things which are different, hence the popularity of travel photography in programs. So for instance, India. Have you ever seen anybody go to India and take a photo of a guy in a suit coming out of an office block? 99% of photos taken in India by people who've travelled there will be of sort of the beautiful clothes, the interesting characters, the people, the different environment. People take photos of things there which are different from their everyday experience. However, you may also be inspired by things which are closer to home. You may want to show people the reality of the world you came from. You may have something to say about that. So in summary, a strong photo with impact is about something, not of something. You may not always be able to explain it in words, but the image itself does the explaining. But you must know in your heart what it's about. Now, the about, as opposed to the of, can be a difficult concept to grasp. I mean, I know prior to doing this talk, I used to talk about it with some friends in my camera club, and they'd look at me like I've gone a little bit bonkers. Luckily, they've seen this talk and it did make a little bit more sense to them. Hopefully it will to everybody. So these are both photographs of bears, but they're about 2 totally different things. The bear on the left is peace, relaxation, tranquility. you're looking through that, or looking past that out of focus foreground. It almost feels like you've intruded in a private moment. The one on the right, however, is all about family dynamics. You've got mother, I'm assuming it's mother and the two cubs. The cubs are playing behind her. It's about relationships, about play. The position of the mother always does interest me in this image, however. She's either keeping an eye out for potential danger for her cubs, or she's just got really fed up with them. And it's like, oh, for goodness sake, children, I've had enough. Calm down. I'm ignoring you. But they're both of bears, but they're about totally different things. Peace, relaxation, tranquility, family, play. Now, this image was taken in Stratford, East London. I stopped because of the light, but I selected it out of the many I took because of the emotion and mood. It's of the girl, but it's about how she's feeling. It's about the expression on her face and her body language. She just looked so tired and weary heading for the station at the end of the day. And that's the bit which made me, out of all the photos I've taken, as you can imagine, this is street photography. There's a lot of people coming past. I took quite a few images, but this is the one I selected. It is all because of that mood and atmosphere. Don McCullen stated, "Photography for me is not looking, it's feeling. If you can't feel what you're looking at, then you're never going to get others to feel anything when they look at your pictures." So if you look at this image, what do you think his point of view was? What do you think he was trying to express? Where do you think his sympathy lie? If you look at what he's chosen to include within the image, this was taken at the Cuban Missile Crisis protest in 1962. Now, it's a protest. There's going to be a lot more people than that one guy there, I'm pretty sure. However, he's chosen to shoot just that one guy on the floor with a big line of police in front of him. Also, looking at the positions, because he's sitting down, the police are towering above him. It gives a feeling about power dynamics there. And also look at, he's wearing this lightish top. The police are all these dark, severe outfits. Once again, it's conveying something. So it's very much looking at that, thinking about what is he trying to say with it? Is he being neutral about this, or is he trying to communicate a perspective on the whole situation? And this is another photo I've taken. Now, I wrote this talk before Ukraine happened, but I think is actually very relevant still today, this photo and what's happening currently over there. It's once again, it's an image by Don McCullen, The Battle for the City of You. He's just included 3 things in the frame: the soldier, the window, and the portrait of the family. And that portrait of the family is critical because it's no longer an image about war and troops fighting against each other. It's put into the human context. It's about how war destroys lives. It impacts the innocents. But once again, it's a photograph which says something, and that's what gives it its impact. Now, these are 2 really good quotes. David Allen Harvey: "Don't shoot what it looks like, shoot what it feels like." Then Robert Henri, who's a painter: "Paint the flying spirit of the bird rather than its feathers." And once again, it's all on the subject of communication through your images. Now, this is an image of Amberley Wildbrooks in flood. Amberley is a small village, and behind it is the Wildbrooks. this is an area of managed wetland. Whilst floods are quite often a big deal for people, the wetlands here are meant to flood. They flood every year. It's more concerning if they don't actually flood. So the flood itself is nothing unusual. But for me, there's this curious beauty in the winter on the wild rooks. The floods create their own new and wondrous landscapes. They simplify things. They create a sense of peace and tranquility. They transform the environment. It's very much, as I say, trying to capture that. And this is an image I took during the first lockdown. And it's very much in response to the lockdown. It's very much a reaction to. Now, this is an image from a gentleman called Alistair Benn from Scotland, landscape photographer. And he's from a series, Music from Dark Spaces. It's of a tree in the wood, but it's about so much more. You've got this beautiful light shining through. It's just picking out the leaves. It creates this real sense of magic in the environment. It's about much more than its raw ingredients. And this is an image from an amazing Japanese photographer, Yasuhiro Ogawa. It's from his photo book, The Dreaming, which was published in February 20, and which I'm very lucky to have a copy of. It's a collection of black and white photographs shot during his travels throughout Asia over the past 30 years. And if you look at this, it's of a forest in winter, but it's about so much more. It's got this, once again, this real sense of magic within the image. It's not, when you look at this, would you think it's clinical? No, it's got mood, it's got atmosphere, it's got a story. Apologies to everyone if you can hear my very loud cat. I knew she was going to make a protest at some point today. I'm in the wrong room. She doesn't approve of me being in the wrong room. Shutting the door doesn't help. She might be small, but she's very loud. You can still hear her through it. So please excuse her. So I would say there's 3 stages in photography. The taking stage, the photo selection stage, and the post-processing stage. The taking stage is where you initially select your subject matter, frame it, make technical choices and press the button. You set yourself up for success. Now, image selection is critical. When you get your photos home, which ones speak to you? Out of all the photos you've taken, which ones are you going to process and show people? An understanding of visual design and how composition impacts the viewer can help you become better at choosing your strongest images. And we're going to come more onto this in parts 2 and 3. And then finally, post-processing. Through your post-processing choices, you continue on the journey of ensuring you're communicating effectively through your images. And I would say the 5 questions which can help you make more impactful images. What do I see? What is the mood and atmosphere? What do I feel? What's the feeling I want to convey? How do I want the viewer to respond and feel when they look at it? And what can I eliminate to show this better? Last bit, absolutely critical. We're going to come on to that more later on in the talk. So, in summary, photography is a visual language. It's a form of communication without words. As a photographer, we aim to develop our visual language to make images which connect with the audience. We can only connect with the audience if we ourselves connect with the subject matter. Strong images are about something, not of something. Poppy agrees. You can hear the background. Cat. Through the understanding of the tools of composition, we can make a photograph feel like we want it to. It allows us to let the viewer into our world. We can enable the viewer to feel like they were there alongside us. We can provoke emotion in the viewer. We can raise awareness of something which concerns us, and we can tell stories. Or we can even say something as simple as, wow, look at this. How amazing or beautiful the light is here. A core part of photography as a visual language is understanding the principles of visual design. When you understand this, you stop worrying about rules and breaking them. You understand the impact of your decisions on the viewer and can make informed choices. And we're going to go into this in more detail in section 2. But through an understanding of visual design at the taking stage, image selection stage, and subsequent work in post-processing, you can control where the viewer looks, in what order they look at the objects in your image, what they perceive the subject to be, and how they experience the environment the subject is in. So for instance, is it cold, warm, relaxing, scary, decaying? And therefore, how they actually experience the whole image. What do they understand from it? And this is why you need to have your own voice. If you don't know what you're trying to say with an image, how can you actually convey it to the viewer? And I think this quote from David Duchamine is really important. You can put the main subject on the leftmost third of your image and still have an image without heart. You can watch the edges of your frame and make sure your portrait subject is looking into and not out of the frame, as you've been told to do. You can keep your horizon straight and get high marks at the camera club and still not have an image that feels the way you hoped it would. Why? Because composition and all the principles that we need to understand to make our photographs do the million things we might ask them to do are only tools. It's how we use them that matters. So that's the end of section 1, coming on to section 2. And this is looking at in more detail how we make sense of the visual world. Psychology plays an important role in both the creating of images and how we interpret and understand them. And if this had been a smaller group, I would have asked you to call out what you see in the next slide. But looking at this, thinking to yourself, how many of you would have said zebra? Is that, if I'd asked you, what is this? Would you have come back and said zebra? I would bet about 99% of you probably would have said that. However, look at it in more detail. Look at the forelegs, especially that one the furthest away from us. There's no detail whatsoever. There's a couple, 3 black lines, the rest of it's white. There's no outline around that zebra at all. What it is actually is just a collection of black shapes on a white background. Your mind fills in the missing information and translates the shapes into something recognizable to you based on your past experience. Now this is similar to the zebra. If I'd shown you this in advance, most of you would have said square, circle, triangle. The zebra gives you hints, however. In actual fact, once again, they're just a lot of short black lines on a white background. It's our brain trying to create order out of the chaotic world around us. It prefers complete shapes, so it automatically fills in the gaps. And this is the Gestalt principle of closure. When we see an image that has missing parts, if enough of the shape is indicated, the viewer will fill in the gaps. So in the case of square, circle, triangle, zebra, our brain completed shapes that don't actually exist. According to Gestalt psychology, how we interpret what we see in the world very much depends on what we expect to see. One theory is that our ability to fill in the missing parts is the result of evolution, a hangover from many millions of years ago. So, for example, if there was a lion partially hidden by grass and you could only see bits of it, if you had to think about all the individual bits and try and make sense of them, you'd probably be dinner before you'd worked it out. Our ancestors' ability to recognize a predator, even though they've only seen parts of it, was key to their survival. So how can we photographers use Gestalt theory of closure to our advantage? One of the ways to keep the viewer involved in our photographs is to have them complete an image, a form, or an idea. In other words, fill in the blanks. By having the viewer work at filling in the missing pieces in an image, he becomes an active participant, and he'll stick around that bit longer looking at our photographs. It also means that we don't have to show the viewer everything in our image. You can include part of a shape, for instance, part of a person, and the viewer will do the work and mentally perceive the whole person. So coming back to this image we saw earlier on, we've only got the legs of these people. When you looked at it, did you just think of it of legs without a body, or did you think of the whole person? That wall, you can't see the top of the wall, but you imagine that the whole wall is there. And that's the Gestalt theory of continuation. As a little hint, however, that's not actually a proper wall. This was taken in Canary Wharf. It's quite a low wall. He's actually looking over the top of it. But, and they say a lot of Gestalt principles overlap, but basically the mind fills in the blanks. It interprets things based on what they expect to see. So you look at that, you'd expect it to be a big wall, and then it asks questions. What's that guy doing standing facing a big wall? Honest answer, looking over the top of it. Nothing to do with the guy walked off. But it's how cropping and such like, you can create those stories. You can encourage viewers to fill in the blanks, sometimes not accurate blanks. So what are Gestalt principles? They were developed by German psychologists in the 1920s. They were used to explain how we perceive things, how we make sense of visual elements in the world around us. Gestalt psychology suggests that we do not simply focus on every small component, but rather view them as part of a greater whole. When we are faced with a visually chaotic scene, our mind simplifies it into more recognizable patterns and shapes, such as we saw earlier with the square, circle, triangle, and zebra. In Gestalt, they summarize this and say, the whole is other than the sum of its parts. So in our photography, we can use knowledge of Gestalt theories to create a story or suggest something to the viewer in a better way. So for instance, if we want to imply movement, it's often effective to leave space before or after the object that is moving. You leave space for them to move into or out of. So if you look at this shot from the polo match, they've got plenty of space to move into. They've also got the ball in front of them where they're actually galloping towards. Now look at this. Now compare this to the next image I'm about to show you, and think about which feels most dynamic, which is the greatest sense of movement. You've got that with space to move into, or that where you've much closer, tighter crop. And if you look at them next to each other, the one on the left, it's got space to move into, it's about the game, it's about them racing from the ball. By the fact that it's about something, by the fact that you've done a much closer crop on the right one, it's of the polo players, it's of what the polo players look like. It's not necessarily telling the same story. Another example is football. The viewer knows how a kicked football would travel through the air. By leaving space for it to move into, we're encouraging the viewer to fill in the blanks in the story and imagine its trajectory. And as mentioned before, If we encourage the viewer to fill in blanks, we're turning viewing from a passive into an active activity, and this can therefore help engage them with the image. So the next one is Gestalt theory of proximity. And I should say, I'm not going through all the Gestalt theories today because we'd be here for a lot longer than the 2 hours. But I'm just picking out some of the key ones. In the Gestalt theory of proximity, our brain wants to reduce confusion and chaos. So it groups objects that are close together as one unit rather than seeing them as individual objects. Objects that are near each other are perceived as belonging together. You'll naturally read this image as a square and 3 columns of blue dots. There's no actual real relationship between the dots other than the grouping and the closeness to each other. The objects don't need to be similar in any other way other than being close to each other. The further apart they are, the more the connection is reduced. So for instance, in photography, if you want to create a connection between people in an image, if you want to create a sense of relationship between them, you need to group them close together in the frame. Conversely, if you want to express loneliness and isolation, it often pays to separate one object from the group. Now, this is an image by James Naqvi. It's of a rehab centre for heroin addicts in Pakistan. If you look at how he's composed this and what it says about the experience, you've got these guys in this dark room in just sitting in pools of light. But look at the separation between them. You have the guy on the right to the far right, then the next person is at the far left of the frame. It creates that sense of isolation and that separateness. It's battles they're having to go through together. So battles they're having to go through on their own. They're not going through it together. So it's very much the opposite of having them close together in a relationship. So I do a bit of event photography at horse shows. So the next few images are taken from there. I have to admit, this image also always amuses me. It's just how wet they are. Everything, okay, I was that wet as well myself, but that photo still makes me laugh by just how wet everything is. But if you look at the groupings, you have a group of 3 on the left, and then 1 guy on his own on the right. You automatically assume that that woman is connected to the guy and his horse in some way. It could be his groom, it could be his daughter, it could be his granddaughter, but you assume there's a connection between them by the fact they're grouped together and separate from the guy next to them. Now, we're not actually given any additional information. For all we know, she could actually be a total stranger to the guy she's standing near. She could have been the groom of the guy on the right and has literally just stepped over for a moment in time to help the guy out on the left. But by the fact that they're close together, you get that impression that there's a relationship between the 3 of them. They're connected in some way. Also, coming back to the Gestalt theory of closure, look at the guy on the right in the carriage. You can't see the horses, you can't see the whole carriage. Do you just imagine he's sitting on a partial carriage? No. Your brain fills in the gaps, and it shows you don't need to show everything in the image for the viewer to understand it. So looking at these 2 images, which would you say best expresses best harmony and teamwork? They were just taken seconds apart. But an understanding of Gestalt principles helps with the image selection. So if you wanted to express teamwork and harmony, the one on the left works better. So if you look at the one on the right, it's actually split into 2 groups. So you've got the lady in the front with the skew board, and the lady at the back with the horse turning its head. By the fact that horse has turned its head, you've created separation between the 2 different elements. And suddenly you've got from one team to 2 groups separate to each other. And here we have a beach scene. Looking at this, I think most people would assume it's a family grouping. It's based on how we understand the world. We automatically assume there's two kids and a woman. They're probably going to be her kids. They're on holiday somewhere. But actually, once again, we're not given any real information. These may not be her children. She may not have ever met them before. She may not be connected to them in any way. But it's just because they're close to her, you get the impression that they're actually one group together. If this, however, had been a landscape crop and she had been on one side of the image and the children had been on the far side of the image, it would have told a totally different story. They could have been her children, but by the separation, you'd have broken that feeling of family grouping. This theory can also be used for things such as optical illusions. Here, the photographer has used the closeness of the sun and the girl's foot and leg to create the optical illusion that she's kicking the sun. The proximity of the foot, leg, and sun mean they're grouped together in the viewer's mind, and it allows the photographer to sell their concept to the viewer. And it also relies on the fact that photography is 2D, not 3D. It's flat. All sense of distance is lost. You can also see this effect in images such as the typical tourist image of someone holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa, someone in the foreground taking the pose, Leaning Tower of Pisa in the background. And it's why we need to be careful of the background behind our subject so that we don't get trees growing out of somebody's head. Now, Gestalt principle of similarity. We see objects that are similar in shape, size, colour and texture as belonging together, like a flock of sheep. According to Gestalt theory, it's our brain simplifying the parts of the image to make it easier to read. If you had to mentally think sheep, 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 when you see a group of them, it'll be hard work and time consuming. So instead, we group them together and think of them as a flock as opposed to individual sheep. In this image, the red circles are seen as related to the other red circles. The black circles are related to the black circles. Our mind splits the image into two separate groups, black and red. In a busy scene, using the principle of similarity will simplify the image and help the subject stand out from surrounding elements. One element is different from everything else. There is visual contrast, and it's this which engages our mind. So, similar to sheep example, colony of penguins. I have to confess, I'm not a nature photographer. I had to look up what a group of penguins were called. I personally like the idea of calling them a herd of penguins. But then again, I like the idea of a herd of butterflies, so you probably better ignore me. But if you look at the image itself, you don't think baby penguin, baby penguin, baby penguin, baby penguin, baby penguin, adult penguin, baby penguin. You think baby penguins, adult penguin. And because you've divided it into two groups, the adult penguin stands out. He's different from everything else within that image. Now, this is an image of mine which uses both proximity and similarity. It was taken on the London Underground, and for me, it very much reflects the urban condition, what life is like when you live in a really highly densely populated area. You're very close to people, but you're not connected with them. Here, you've got the guy on the left, on the right. He's looking in the direction of the woman, but not seeing. There's that implied line of sight, but there's no connection. And then you've got the woman on the left, very typical London, rushing through, coffee in hand. Strangers close together, but not connecting, separated. But looking at how I've used proximity and similarity. Proximity, easiest, they're close together within the frame. So it helps that creation of connection, or rather connection, but no connection. But similarity, For a start, if you look at them, okay, they're both wearing dark outfits and they have light faces. They're the only people whose faces you can see within the image. So automatically you've got similarity there and a connection. But also I've chosen to make it black and white. If, for instance, he'd been wearing a bright blue coat and she'd been wearing a bright red coat, some of that similarity would have broken up. There wouldn't have been that strong connection between the two due to the similarity of the shading within them. So making it black and white made it more homogeneous, for want of a better word. And it comes back to sort of telling stories within your image and using the tools to help you better tell that story. So a few more. Because if you look at this image, it's something I took at Stratford Station. Stratford Station, for those who don't know, is a station in East London, big station, very busy. But looking at this, what do you think the conditions in the tube carriage are like? What do you think conditions on the platform are like? Do you think the crowd of people trying to get onto the tube is large or small? Is the rest of the platform full or empty? What do you think I'm saying about travelling on the tube in rush hour? We're actually given very little information because we can't see what's happening outside the frame or inside the tube. For all we know, the people could have been at the edges of the crowd. It could have been empty. The platform itself could have been empty beyond them. The train could be relatively empty. It could have been a train just arrived in the station. People have surged forward to get onto the train. The train's actually straight out of depot, because, so it's empty. As for we know, we're not given that information. We assume certain conditions from what we see. And this is the Gestalt principle of continuation. The mind assumes that lines and objects which go to the edge of the frame extend beyond the edges of the frame. So we assume that that crowd continues in a similar fashion across the whole platform. We assume it continues in a similar fashion into the tube, also emphasised by that boy half in, half out of the frame.
Wow.
Of course, this is London. You'd be very lucky to actually get an uncrowded platform and an unclouded tube. But we don't know, we've got no information to go from. Through the choice of crop, we've created the story we want to do. And you can use this for a whole wide range of subjects. So for instance, if you're photographing a field, if you show the fences at the either edge of it, you've limited the size of the field. If you'd cut out the fences, the brain thinks that field will go on in a similar fashion. It can make a small field feel much bigger. Or forests, or sort of trees. If you have a group of trees, if you crop in, even if it's a small group of trees, if you crop into the edges of them and don't leave space either side, the brain can get the impression that a small group of trees is actually a big forest. However, if you left space either side, you can make it feel like a small group of trees. So it all depends really on what you're trying to say. Now, this image uses both closure and continuation. The photographer takes the viewer on a journey through the use of leading lines. Whilst leading lines often lead to the subject, they can lead absolutely anywhere in the image, depending on how you want the viewer to experience the image. They don't even need to be actual lines, they can be implied lines. Here, you have a strong sense of what's going to happen next, even if it's not shown in the photo. And remember earlier on what I said about leaving space for things to move into? To be fair on the girl, she didn't actually fall off. The horse put its neck up, she slithered back into the saddle, she did its circle and cleared the jump next time. You wouldn't know it from the shot, but we should be fair on her because she did an amazing save. Now, figure to ground. Now, this is a really important principle. It's about making clear to the viewer what your subject is, making your subject stand out. Sometimes the viewer's eyes can't see a subject clearly because it's merged with his background or other elements in the photo. Photography is 2D, so whilst in the real world we see separation in space, it doesn't exist in photography. The figure-to-ground principle helps us to explain which element will be perceived as a subject and which element will be the background. Our mind tends to perceive the area with most contrast as a subject and the larger area as the background. So in short, think light on dark, dark on light. When someone talks about separation in the image, this is normally what they mean. It's about making your subject stand out from the background. So if we look at this image from the iconic street photographer Van Gogh, his images, if you haven't come across him, look him up, he's brilliant. But his images are largely about light, shade, shape and form. And if you look at this, is it obvious immediately what the subject is? Where does your eye go? Is that guy in the boat? And what makes a difference? It's because he's positioned against that really, really bright light behind him. He stands out from that. If Van Gogh had positioned the guy against the dark walls on the dark side, it wouldn't have stood out half as clearly. So light on dark, dark on light. Coming back to Yasuhiro Ogawa, it's another image from his book, The Dreaming. Where before we had dark on light, this is light on dark. You've got that dark landscape and just those two small train carriages in the distance, a lot brighter than surrounding areas. The train carriages themselves become the subject. This is where your eye goes because of the contrast. This is an image by me taken in Bradford one summer. Once again, the same principle. Do the main subjects stand out? Absolutely. Dark on light. They're not blending into the background, they stand out quite clearly from them. But you can also use other ways to achieve this technique. So for instance, depth of field, as we commonly see in wildlife photography. Here the owl stands out clearly from the background due to the contrast between him being sharp and the out of focus background. If that background hadn't been so out of focus, there wouldn't have been such strong contrast and he wouldn't have stood out so clearly. Okay, that's the end of section 2. Time for a short break. If everyone's okay with that?
Yes, that's
Okay, brilliant. So thank you, everybody. This is section 3. I was just checking, you can see section 3, can't you?
Yes, we can. We see you.
So we'll quickly look at first. There are a large amount of visual elements which influence how viewers experience our images. This list just contains some of them. The ones in blue are the ones we're going to go over in more detail. As you can imagine, if we try to cover everything, you guys would be here pretty much all week, really. One of the hardest things is I keep trying to cut this talk down. It's one of the most challenging things because there is so much within it, within the subject itself. But it's also why I give people references, because it's such an interesting subject to explore. But look, so the ones in blue are the ones we're going to be looking at, but other things include the scale of the image. If you print it big or small, it influences how the viewer interacts with the image, how fast our shutter speed moves and what that does to our experience of time, the moment we choose, elements we exclude which are critical, our background and life experiences, that impacts very much how we interpret an image. But also, I'm briefly going to talk about it here, colour and saturation. the use of colour and saturation has a really strong impact on the mood of an image. Filmmakers use it all the time. So when things are bright, positive, happy and cheerful, the photos are saturated and colourful. Often you find them using warm colours for the positive elements and desaturated and bluer toned colours for the more scary, negative, not so positive elements. But a really good thing to look at to see how it's used is actually charity adverts. You frequently see colour and saturation used to subtly influence the viewer. So you have the before, and this is when the person or animal is suffering. Often the colours are desaturated, often cooler colours are used. And then you've got the ask, please give us money to fix this. And then they show what happens once people have donated money and they can actually fix whatever it is they're trying to fix. And the after is so often they go from desaturated and cooler tones to much more saturated, much warmer tones. And it's all done to subtly influence the perception of the viewer. Desaturated, cooler for the negative. You give money, you make things better, warmer, more saturated. But I say the blue ones are the ones we're going to go over in more detail. So framing and simplification. If there's one thing that will improve the composition of your photos above everything else is this, simplification. What's in the frame, what's out of it? Simplification makes it very clear what the subject is and what you want the viewer to look at. Eliminate everything that isn't necessary. Everything you put in the image, the viewer will believe is there on purpose. The more you have in an image, the more you dilute the impact. If you have 10 elements in the frame, the viewer's attention is split 10 ways. If you have only 3 items in the frame, then their attention is only split 3 ways. Each item in the frame gains increased importance because it's all they have to look at. So look at photographs from great photographers. You often find they've simplified the frame to the core components needed to tell the story. And a good exercise is to actually count the elements in the frame of photographers when you visit galleries or look at books, and then try and extend this to your own work. And on this subject, so as I said, he is mentioned once or twice. We've got another great quote from David Duchamine. I've often heard defensive cries from students when I suggest they've included too much or not enough in their photographs. When I've questioned their framing and asked whether it might be more powerful had different choices been made, I've heard over and over again, but that's how it was. Wrong. The role of the photographer is to make choices. The frame forces us to choose. If you are going to choose, then it's best that you choose whilst keeping in mind that the viewer will make the primary assumption that you have included everything on purpose, that it means something. By the act of putting certain things in the frame and leaving out other things, what we're saying is, look at these, they're important. Key things to remember. The frame isolates and gives the photograph its power to make the seemingly unimportant or unseen significant. It brings to the attention of the viewer the subject which we want to express an opinion about and show the world. The frame can also take things out of their context and create relationships which did not exist before. You can use it to tell new stories by separating the individual elements from their surroundings. You can use your choice of framing to create new realities without ever having to use Photoshop. So images you see in the news of the same event can tell entirely different stories depending on what the photographer included or what he didn't include. So we talked earlier on about photographs of something as opposed to about something. What's this photo of? Pony on top of a grass bank at a horse show with a mouth full of grass. Child is holding onto its reins. What's it about? Naughty pony, pissed off child, day's obviously not gone that well. But if we look at the different framing, in the first image, the bank takes up nearly a third of the image. Therefore, it takes up nearly a third of our attention. And the question you need to ask yourself is, what does the bank add to the story? Is it important information? Do we need as much of it? The impact of the pony and child in the frame and the story is far greater in image 2 than 1, because we reduce the amount of bank, and therefore that area takes less of our attention. So if you compare that one to that one, and here the actual story of the pony, the child, it stands out that much stronger based on the fact that they're much larger within the frame, because you've reduced the amount of bank for the viewer to look at. And here we've got a photo I took at Photo London. When I put this talk together, I hadn't actually realised I've basically gone from pissed off child to pissed off child. Entire accident, not intended, but it flows quite well. This is not a setup. I've been asked this before. The person in the background was a poster, and this man and that child just happened to be walking past. The child, I think it's been a long day. She's tired. She's grizzling on her father's shoulder. She's not happy. What really attracted me to the image, however, was the connection between the figure in the poster and the man and the child. That figure in the person in the poster seems almost to be reached. You've got that implied line of sight as the gaze is going towards the man and the child, and that gesture with the arm, and it almost feels like she's reaching out, showing concern for the child. Once again, only child, overactive imagination. But the cropping wise, I very purposely excluded as much as I could from the frame, so that to bring out that story. If there'd been more within the frame, that story itself, the impact of it would have been diluted. And this is, we saw this image before, the Don McCullum one. Once again, very intentional, deliberate crop. Imagine if he'd included a lot more of the room. You'd had sofas and chairs and various other things, carpets and whatever else was in that room. The man, the picture and the window, the impact of those, then it would have had to compete with a lot more for the viewer's attention. And therefore the impact of that picture within the frame wouldn't have been as strong as it is here, where you've only given the viewer 3 main things to look at. However, what you leave in can be as important as what you take out. This is, and it depends what you want the image to feel like. Now, this is an image from Martine Frank from her series French on Vacation. And she was a partner of Henri Cartier-Bresson and very much was successful and wanted to be successful in her own right, not to have her success associated with a connection to him. And here, if you look at this image, there's this slightly surreal feeling to it. It just feels that little bit odd. So you've got the guy in the hammock, the woman in the background doing the yoga downward dog movement, the other lady, and there's strange white ball lamps. It all creates that slight feeling of surreality. Now imagine if she'd done if she'd cropped this. So for instance, she just had that boy in the hammock and didn't have anything in the background, or she just had those people in the background doing the yoga moves. Would the impact have been the same? Here it's deliberately leaving in everything within that image to create that mood and feel. And there's an absolutely great, image was actually from her series French on Vacation. And from that series is a great quote from her. Doing this work, I realised essentially that you can either suffer a holiday or enjoy it, and it's not always a choice. So visual weight, visual hierarchy. This is how the elements relate to each other, and it impacts how the viewer reads the image. It impacts how their eye moves through the image. Visual weight tells you what to look at. Visual hierarchy tells you in what order to look at things. Every element in a frame exerts a certain amount of pull on the eye of the viewer. Our eyes are drawn to some things over other things. The greater the visual weight an element in a photograph has, the more the eye is drawn to that element over other elements in the frame. So making a significant element larger, brighter, sharper, more saturated, or so forth, will make it more dominant. It will have more visual weight. Understanding this and playing with it is key to saying what you want to with an image and directing the way the viewer experiences your image. So visual weight is not just about composition, it's about message. You tend to look at things with the greatest visual weight first. So in this image, the element of the greatest visual weight is the boy. Your eye gets drawn to him more strongly. He's the brightest element. He's got eye contact with the viewer. He's wearing that bright, saturated red jacket. He clearly stands out as the main element. However, it's been worthwhile being aware that if there are multiple elements have a lot of visual weight within your image, the image itself can become confusing. It's unclear to the viewer what the subject is and what the photographer wants them to focus on. Things which pull the eye change with context. Unfortunately, there's no definitive list. But as a guideline, larger or dominant objects over smaller ones. Sharp areas over out of focus ones. And this is why it's important that the subject of the image is the sharpest area within the image, unless you're deliberately using movement blur or such like for a reason. But typically your eye will be pulled to the sharpest element in the image and will associate that as a subject. Light tones over dark tones, but as we've seen, contrast, which can actually cancel that out, and the contrast being the stronger element. Human over inorganic, saturation. So as you can see, there's a lot of elements which impact visual weight, but there's a great little exercise I saw on a website called Tuts Plus. Now it's simple image, cool tones. It's quite easy for the eye to travel up through the image to the volcano in the background. The volcano, there's a brighter area around the volcano. You've got the strong contrast of the volcano with the lighter area. Now they played a bit and shone a red gel on the foreground. And this impacts the way the viewer actually sees and reads the image. Suddenly, your eye gets pulled to the base of the image, to the foreground. It's not so easy for the eye to travel up to the mountain. Your eye gets pulled, as I said, to the red area because it's saturated, it's bright, there's strong contrast. It's a large area. And if you compare the two, you can see in the first image, your eye tends to go to the volcano. The second one, the eye tends to go to the foreground. And it all depends, where do you want the viewer to look? If you wanted them to look at the volcano in the background, the first one is better. If for you, the most interesting part of the image was the foreground, then the second image would be better because your eye gets pulled to the foreground. You can use visual weight and visual hierarchy to control, as I said, how the eye moves through the image and directs the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. So this is an image of mine. I would say the before and after, but it's like halfway through and after. But the main difference here is the use of brightness. Because on the image on the left, it's fairly flat. The guy on the table tends to merge a bit with the background, doesn't really stand out. Your eye gets pulled all around the image. On the one on the right, I've brightened him. He pops out a lot more. He's much more the subject now. He stands out within the image. That's where your eye gets pulled first. I think it always makes me laugh because entering competitions in camera clubs, I've often been told, oh, you've had really good light there. And it's like, yeah, it really wasn't when I started. You can create your own good light in post-processing by lightening and darkening areas to bring out your subject. So you have that one versus that one. This is an image by Josef Kudelka, very famous image from the Prague Spring. He took this photo at the moment the Soviet troops invaded. What you may not be aware of, however, was at the time he was a theatre photographer. He didn't do news events. A year after these images reached New York, Magnum Photos distributed them under, accredited to an unknown Czech photographer. They needed to avoid reprisals. Still anonymous, he was awarded the Robert Capa Award. It took 16 years before Kudelka could safely actually acknowledge authorship of this image. But if you look at the visual weight, visual hierarchy bit, where does your eye automatically go first? Is that arm in the foreground? Human, large, contrast with the street behind. It's very much your eye goes to the arm and watch first, and then the street second. Image by René Barré. Where does the eye go first? You have those figures on the roof. You've got the roof is the brightest area in the image. You've got the human figures, and there's really strong contrast of the figures against the bright area. So your eye very much gets pulled to that roof and the figures on them first of all. And then it tends to go down to the road, sort of the next brightest area, with it, and then it goes to the building itself. Then we have this image by Martin Parr. And once again, what is the subject? Is it clear what the subject is? Where does your eye get pulled first? Very much to that girl. Why? Well, she's the biggest element in the frame. Everybody else has been cut off by the counter. You've just got torsos and bits of torsos. You see the whole of her. Colour contrast. Everything's a kind of soft, warm tones, that soft blue, that sort of the skin tones. She's wearing black. She contrasts strongly, tonally from the rest of the image. But also you've got that strong eye contact. Everyone else is tending to be looking down or towards her. With her, you have that strong eye contact with the viewer, which once again gives her visual weight. And it all makes her the first thing you look at in the image, and then your eye explores the rest of the image. So awareness of and using visual weight and hierarchy will give us greater control over how the final image will be experienced by the viewer. If we're aiming to make a photograph about something, not of something, an understanding of this helps significantly in achieving our goals. If the area with greatest visual weight is not the subject of the image, then you won't communicate as clearly. The viewer's eyes will be pulled to the wrong things. Your message will be diluted or lost. The next bit is visual intensity, which comes from that last book I mentioned. Visual intensity is the amount of energy in an image. Too little or too much energy can make the image unappealing. If a person plays a single note over and over and over and over again, it will be boring. In contrast, too much energy in an image can make it visually overwhelming. So for instance, it's like being asked to listen to 5 songs at once with the volume turned as high as it will go. It sounds just like noise. It won't be comfortable. You kind of want to just go back out of the room again. And there's a happy medium where the music is not monotone and isn't just noise. Photography operates in a similar fashion. There's a happy medium of visual intensity needed to create an appealing image. However, as a photographer, you should choose a level of visual intensity in your image so it reflects the mood you want to create. A busy city will have more visual intensity than a minimalist Zen landscape. This is an intentional decision. However, even Zen landscapes still need to have enough visual intensity to remain engaging for the viewer and not boring. You can work out an image's visual intensity by breaking it down into its individual components and thinking about how dynamic is each element. How much energy does it bring to the image? If you know what sort of things make an image visually intense, you can then make conscious decisions. Is your image visually overwhelming? Is your Zen-like image calm, or is the energy so low that it's boring to look at? Or even, is your Zen-like image too busy and not calm enough? These decisions happen in the taking, image selection, and post-processing stages. And as with everything else, personal taste comes into it. It is subjective. So this is an image by Trey Radcliffe. For me personally, I find the visual intensity too high. I just find it that little bit visually overwhelming. You've got the richly saturated colours. You've got the strong orange contrasting with the strong green. You've got all those lines of the tree, I think it's probably bamboo trunks or stems going up. So it's got strong pattern, and then you've got those really bright highlights coming through from the canopy above. Everything about it shouts at you a bit. However, if you look at this image from the same author, now this is taken in a busy, bustling city. You've got lots of contrast, all the different shapes of the signs. You've got the different colours, the oranges and the yellows. However, there is a blue tone to it, and that bluish tone acts as it makes it feel calmer. It takes some of the intensity out of the image. So he's still got the feeling of a really busy, bustling, vibrant city, but it's not so overpowering. However, you can choose to actually deliberately make an image feel edgy. This is an image I took around East London, and I've consciously made it feel really edgy and slightly uncomfortable to sort of reflect the environment around. So you have that guy, he's walking through the image of the phone. As he's a subject, you'd typically expect him to be sharp, but he's not, and that in itself creates visual tension, because what you'd expect to be sharp is not sharp, so it creates some of the uneasiness. And then you've got that very busy black and white background, and then that contrasting bit of graffiti, that's actually a mirror, with a bit of graffiti on the wall behind. So everything within it, it's meant to make it feel edgy, uncomfortable, urban, sort of reflecting a slightly edgier area of the city. Once again, it comes to choice. But in contrast, and I think you need a break from edgy and urban, we have Michael Kenner, the king of minimalist Zen stunning images. Here, this is an image he's taken from Hokkaido. Very calm, very simple. But within the image, there's a few tools he's used to add that little bit of visual intensity, that little bit of energy to make it feel engaging. So you have the fence in the foreground, which is just that slightly bit uneven. Evenness creates and symmetry is low energy. So when you break that up, you add a bit of energy to it. But also you look at that fence going in the diagonals. Diagonals are a very dynamic line. They add energy to an image. So once again, a simple image with the inclusion of a diagonal line within it can make it more visually engaging, while still saying what he wants to with the image itself. So then looking at placement of objects. Here I was playing down at the River Thames. One of the advantages with the digital camera is you can experiment and play, explore the subject, explore what works and doesn't work. There's a lot of snobbery often about taking a lot of images, but actually you can use this as a tool to actually, as I said, to work out what works and what doesn't. And I basically call these sketch images. They're like when a painter creates sketches before creating their finished canvas. So if you look at these two images, the only difference between them is the placement of the lampposts. But there's a lot more visual tension in the first image compared to the second. The visual intensity is higher. And this is because the lampposts in the first image are a lot closer together. They don't have so much space to breathe. When things are closer together like that, your eye groups them, it flits back and forth between them. by just giving that little bit more space between them, you've broken that down. You've taken out some of the visual intensity. You've taken out some of that visual conflict and tension. So where you place the objects in your image in relation to each other impacts on visual intensity and visual tension. So just compare them. That compared to that. The only difference is the placement of the lampposts. And then we have portrait versus landscape. Orientation of the frame depends on what you're trying to say with an image. What do you want the photograph to look like or feel like? When you frame a photograph in a landscape or portrait format, you're providing clues to the reader about how you intend the image to be read. You're not just saying, look here, but also look in this direction. So very tall frames emphasize and even exaggerate the height of the subject. They create upward movement. The portrait format can also emphasize the layers in a photograph. It encourages the viewer to read the image vertically from bottom to top. On the other hand, very wide frames generate lateral movement and a sense of panoramic vista. They emphasize the width of something. They encourage you to read the story horizontally. A horizontal framing of a vertical story is likely to mean that we've included more in the frame than we need to. It gives the reader too much to sift through. And imagine if this was framed horizontally, there'll be a lot of dark wall which wouldn't really add anything to the story itself. And with every extraneous element in the frame, the impact of the necessary ones is diminished. And this results in a diluted photograph which is not as strong as it could be. And as I've said before, the more you have in an image, the more you dilute the impact. It also encourages you to read the image. Vertical formats, portrait formats, encourage you to read the image bottom to top. So it takes you through up the stairs to the girl, to the monument behind. This is actually the genocide memorial in Armenia. Now, this is a very rough drawing. I saw the original somewhere, I think in some talk or something, and I've never been able to actually find it again. So you have to apologize for my very roughly drawn image. But it does give you a good illustration of how a gaze travels through an image. In a landscape crop, the passage of the eye through the image is more relaxed and leisurely. Portrait crops, however, are more dynamic than landscape crops, as you can see from the diagram. They have greater visual intensity. They can inject energy into a simple image. And you can use this knowledge to your advantage. If you have a low energy, low visual intensity image, you can make it feel more dynamic by choosing a portrait crop. And it all depends on what you want the energy of the image to be. What do you want the viewer to feel when they look at it? So the next few images are taken in Armenia. Whilst I was writing this talk, I was also going through old photos and trying to have a clear out of my hard drive. And whilst they'll never be award-winning photos, they work quite well to illustrate this point. So as we said, the portrait crop encourages the viewer to read the image bottom to top. It emphasizes the layers. It also makes a simple subject matter more dynamic. Now, the subjects within them are exactly the same, but in the landscape image, you've been given a lot more of the same sort of stuff. So you've got quite a lot of repetition going into that. And it's worth being mindful that when you have a lot of repetition of similar elements, it's a bit like someone sending you an email. They could have sent it to you in 4 bullet points, but they've sent to you it in 2 A4 sheets. You kind of turn off a little bit. So often you can create more impact through less within the image rather than having so much repetition. But I say a simple crop just make portrait or landscape makes so much difference to the feel of the image. You have that versus that. And the only difference is the crop. But I think most people would say that, well, it's never going to be an amazing image. The second one is more engaging. And then I did this with more photos from Armenia, just playing. Same thing, same subject, stream over rocks. And once again, the only difference between these two is the crop. The portrait crop makes it feel more dynamic. It also emphasizes the flow of the stream through the down through the rocks, because it encourages your eye to read it bottom to top. So you have that versus that. Same subject, different crop. The next section is to do with the placement of the subject in the frame. Do you put it in the center, on the third, close to the edge, or cut off by the frame? And this comes back to where I started my journey. Don't just tell me to put something on the third. Tell me what the impact of it is and why it's supposed to make my image stronger. Do I even want to put it there? Why not in the middle or closer to the edge? How does my choice of subject placement affect the viewer? Contrary to popular opinion, there's absolutely nothing wrong with placing your subject in the center of an image. People instinctively spend a lot of time looking at the center of objects. One theory says that our brain assumes the object in the center of the image will be the most important. We look instinctively there. However, this is where an understanding of visual intensity can help. The center of the frame is a very visually balanced position. There's little visual tension there. It's a low energy position. It does not have much visual intensity. And therefore, if you center your subject, it needs to get its energy from other elements within the frame or from the very nature of the subject itself. Moving the subject to the third may not improve the image. It may not communicate effectively what you want to say. The image may work best for the subject in the center. It's all about balancing that energy, as I said, to make it feel like you want it to. And it comes back to the reason I produced this talk. It's about being aware of the decisions you make and how they impact viewer experience. It's about empowerment and about being aware of the tools at your disposal and the fact there are actually no rules. So what impact does placing the subject off center have? Placing the subject on a third adds a moderate amount of energy to the image. It creates a moderate amount of visual tension. The closer the subject is to the edge of the frame, the more dynamic tension will be introduced into the image. If you place the subject facing into the frame, it will move along an implied line of travel and will have a moderate amount of energy. The image will be about what is going to happen next in its motion, thinking back to what we've talked about in Gestalt as well. If the subject is at the edge of the frame moving out, then there's a lot of energy, a lot of visual intensity. It's because the subject's going to leave the frame very quickly, so it soon won't be part of the image. As I say, it comes back to Gestalt. We understand how objects move in the real world. So, for example, the polo players or the football, which has been kicked. Our brain tries to simplify and make sense of the world based on our past experiences and how we understand the world. And this, don't worry, I'm not going to go over this in much detail, but it's just to prove it is actually based on science. People have done a lot of research into this area. And briefly summing this up, it shows that the central position has the least emotional tension within the image. And as you move further away from the central position, there's more tension within the image itself. And then I thought I'd have a little play with the subject matter. And just to sort of show how placement, same image, 3 different crops. First image, central, a bit static. On this particular image, okay, but no cigar. More traditional crop, space for her to move into. It's better than the first one on this subject matter. And my final actual image. I like the visual tension created by the fact that she's actually going out of the image. And I use this quite a lot within my photography because I like how it feels. And that's the thing, it comes back to informed choices. Conversely, however, this guy I placed in the middle of the frame. This was a photo taken out of the top of the bus in Blackpool, because you always see guys running down the road with the TV under their arm. I'm sure it's 100% innocent, nothing to see here, folks. But as you can imagine, on a bus, guy running down the road with the TV, I took more than one image. Why did I choose the one with him very centrally placed and framed between the two gateposts? For me, it was not just about him running down the road with the TV. It was not just about the motion. It was actually about the context in which he's in. It's this very suburban street, which any of us could actually live into. It's the juxtaposition between what he's doing and the environment. If this had been some sort of fairly dodgy industrial estate or somewhere a lot less welcoming feeling, contrast wouldn't have been that great. But it's not just about him and the TV, but it's about the environment. This is an image by Vivian Mayer, taken on Christmas Eve. Once again, central placement. Does it lack impact? Absolutely not. Most logical place to place these people is in the center of the image. It gets energy both from the subject matter itself and what's going on within the frame, and the strong contrast between the surrounding elements, the black and white contrast and how much brighter they are than the street and the environment behind. Now, this is an image from a photographer called Christopher Thomas. He's done an absolutely great series called Bittersweet, which is all about emotions. Central placement. Does this image feel boring? Absolutely not. It asks so many questions of the viewer. I mean, I absolutely love this image. It's, what's that roundabout doing in the middle of the field? Why is it lit up and no one's around? Why are there no children? It feels like such a big empty expanse. Comes back to, what's it doing there? It gains interest because it asks so many questions of the viewer. It's not something you'd walk past, you'd stop and think about it. I think it's also worth two other things to be mindful thinking about this image. The first, coming back to the Gestalt law of continuation. We've literally no idea what's going on either side of that frame. I look at this and think massive, big, empty expanse of nowhere. But as far as I know, there could be a house either side. We're not shown that. He's cropped it deliberately to create and emphasize a sense of emptiness. It could be empty, it may not be, I don't know, but I've got the impression it's a vast sense of emptiness. But it's also how central placement impacts how the viewer's eye moves through the image. When you place something centrally and dominant like this, your eye tends to go to the subject. It's not so easy for your eye to move beyond the subject to the scene behind. It's about the subject as opposed to the environment. In contrast, it's another image by him from the same series. The tricycle is now placed at the edge of the frame. Once again, still asks a lot of questions, still a great image, but it's also then easier for your eye to travel. You look at the tricycle, it's easier to eye to travel up through the image to the mountains beyond and explore the surrounding element. You've given the viewer room for their eye to travel through. And I think it's really useful to think about when you choose where to place a subject, how do you want the viewer's eye to travel through the image? And coming into the final bit, so I appreciate we're running over slightly. So I was looking at lines, three main types of lines: horizontal, vertical, diagonal. Horizontal lines convey a sense of stability and rest, no real potential of energy. They speak of solidity and solid ground. Placed low in the frame, they anchor it. They emphasize something's width. Things we associate with horizontal lines are falling trees, horizons, sleeping people. You sleep lying down. If something's horizontal, it can't fall over. And this emphasizes the feeling of stable and secure. Coming back to Gestalt, there's a lot going on in our head behind what we actually initially think. So if you want to accentuate a calm environment, shooting in a horizontal frame, horizontal lines can emphasize that element. Vertical lines, they convey a sense of different moods in a photograph, from power, strength, growth, dignity, height. They have greater potential to fall over or fall down, which gives them more energy than horizontal lines. And they can be accentuated by shooting in a vertical framing. They also encourage the viewer's eye to move up and down, explore the height of an image. Diagonal lines have the greatest amount of visual intensity. They draw the eye of the viewer through the image, and it gives the image more space, depth, and movement, creates a sense of action, makes an image more dynamic. They lend energy to an image. They can be really useful with a simple image where you want to increase the visual intensity. The brain perceives that diagonal line as the least stable form of line. It's the one which is most likely to fall down, and therefore has the greatest visual tension. So here we have Holcombe Beach. It's all about sort of peaceful tranquility, rest, calmness. Strong letterbox crop, emphasizing the strong horizontal lines going through the image. This is an image taken by Frank Vin, can't pronounce the surname. Strong vertical, nearly vertical lines going through the image. It encourages you to read bottom and top. It emphasizes that feeling of falling. Also coming to the Gestalt theory of continuation, you assume that the building carries on in a similar fashion from the top to the bottom. You've got space for him to fall out of, and you've got space for him to fall into. James McVeigh, Prison on the Chain Gang in Alabama. And everything about this image is designed to create tension. So you've got him partly cropped off within the image, creates visual tension. And then he's dominated by this huge fence above him. And then it makes him feel small, makes him feel vulnerable. And then you've got the strong diagonal lines, adding energy, adding tension to the image again. It's all meant to convey something. It's how you create mood, atmosphere, and story within your image. And this is an image by Alex Soff. Very simple image, very calm, fairly subdued colours, fairly simple subject matter. But through the use of diagonal lines, he's added visual intensity to make it feel more engaging, or make it engage the viewer. So if you look at that mattress is on a diagonal. And then if you look at the reed bed beyond the mattress, that is on a contrasting diagonal. All of this takes a simple image and adds that degree of visual intensity to it so that the viewer's engaged with it. It lifts the energy in the image. It's often frequently used in sports as well. These are two images by Darren Heath. And okay, yes, there's different mood and atmosphere within them in terms of the colours, but sports photographers will often put a subject on a diagonal in order to give that sort of sense of tension, energy, speed, to make the image look like it feels like if you were actually there. So how do you put this into practice? What next? Research the subject more. Mindfully look at a lot of images. Think about the compositional elements and the impact of them. Be conscious of how you respond to the image and how your eye travels through it. Practice. Sketch images. Osmosis. And yes, I'm actually serious about that last bit, as odd as it may sound. The more you look at photography, and you look, not just glancing at it, but looking at it mindfully, thinking about what you like, what you don't like. How has the photographer's compositional choices added to that? What have their choices? What are their choices? Do you find engaging? What are their choices? Don't you like so much? This then seeps into your subconscious and will start coming out through your own photography. And what next? As Martin Parr said famously in an interview, to get good photos, you need to take more shit. All of the above is what we aspire to achieve, but we can only get there through practice. The reality is that even the best professional photographers aim to take 5 to 10 really good photos a year. And therefore we should be kind to ourselves, not place such high expectations on ourselves. Be realistic, especially if you're part of a camera club. There's this constant cycle of trying to produce competition winning images. But if you look at that figure, you know it's not being realistic, and you're potentially losing out on improving by not going out to practice, but going out to try and get an award-winning image. And I always think of a good friend of mine who said about one of his really good images, it was a lucky shot. You make your own luck, however. The more you practice, the more photos you take, the luckier you get. And you can increase the chances of a great image by going out there, and as Martin Parr put it, taking more shit. And if anyone wants to quickly have lead us up for a bit short time, if anyone wants to quickly take a photo of this, just leave it there. So I do have a PDF that if it's to clubs I send out, but I don't think you guys would, from the IPS, would actually want to email this out to the entire world. That'd be rather a lot of extra work. So if you just take a photo. Hopefully that should be, I'm happy to give information to anyone who wants it. That should be okay. Fingers crossed. There.
Carolyn, thank you very, very much for such an informative talk. The effects of our choices, empowering us to shoot not only what we see, but what we feel, teaching us that a strong image is about something and not of something. You spoke of so many elements that produce outstanding images: composition, simplification, importance of message, contrast, intensity, walking us through the steps of shooting, choosing, past processing. Thank you for the references as well. And if you send me the PDF, I will add it to my next broadcast if people would like to refer to it. I don't mind at all.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, because I'm sure many people will probably go back to the recording that will be available. It'll be available with past events on our website, probably within a week to 10 days. Are there any questions for Caroline? You're welcome to speak up and not necessarily put them in the chat. You have many, many thank yous and many outstanding compliments on the chat box. And I think everyone is still in awe of how much we've had to absorb, because there was a lot of subject matter.
It does blow people's brains slightly. I'm used to not having many questions.
When is your book coming out? We've got no answer to that one.
Anyone want to pay me to write one?
You need someone to sponsor your publication.
So you'd said about judges at camera club competitions. Do you now get judges that you disagree with?
How do I put this politely? I would actually probably say that 9 times out of 10. I think it's really difficult to say, to sort of put this politely, but I think a lot of the time judges tend to resort to rotely, they don't look at the mood, they don't look at the atmosphere, they don't look what the image is saying, and they tend to resort to safe cliches, such as you shouldn't have the subject going out of the frame, or you shouldn't cut things off. So when it comes to that element, yes, I do disagree. I'm actually a judge myself.
We're a bit more selective about our judges these days. For precisely this sort of reason, that
Yeah,
we want them to look at the mood of the image, not say things like, oh, that should be on the third.
Yeah. And I think it's important because it can, when done badly, judging can remove people's confidence, but also limit their growth in photography. If it puts people in a really narrow box of what a very conventional sort of photograph is, it will stop their growth.
Yes, absolutely.
No other questions? I thank you again, Caroline. We've had a fantastic morning, and I look forward to looking at the recording again myself. I think we'll give you a virtual hand clap.
Thank you, everybody.